You are listening to InCites, produced by the University of New South Wales Law Society, a podcast dedicated to bring you an insight into law school, the legal profession, and legal issues. The production team would also like to show our respects and acknowledge the Bedegal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land, of elders past and present on which this podcast is made.
Joining us on this podcast today is Rawan Arraf. Rawan is a Palestinian Australian human rights lawyer and is currently the Executive Director of the Australian Centre of International Justice. She completed a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Laws at the University of Sydney. She's finalising her Master of Laws right here at UNSW. Rawan has 10 years of legal experience in refugee protection, administrative law and international human rights law. Rawan most recently worked as a refugee lawyer at Community Legal Centre RACS, providing a wide range of protection advice to people seeking asylum in Australia. She's actively engaged with lawyers and organisations working in universal jurisdiction litigation abroad, and in 2018 trained with the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights, Berlin, working closely with the International Crimes and Accountability Team on universal jurisdiction matters. Thank you, Rawan, for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
So we'll get started with a couple of questions and just getting to know you a bit better. So what inspired you to delve into a career in human rights law, and particularly now with a focus on international human rights?
Thanks so much, Amal, for having me on, and to the Law Student Society and the InCites podcast team. I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Kamayargal country here in North Shore, and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which wherever anyone else is tuning in from. What inspired me to get into human rights law? I think, if I'm being honest, it has to be, I think, being born a Palestinian and my Palestinian identity. I think that has given rise to the need to do something to raise the plight of my people and the Palestinian people. So I think that was probably the main thing that got me into human rights activism, of course, ever since I think the beginning of the first Intifada in 2000. I was in year 10 at the time, so age. But that was really, I think, the awakening for a lot of Palestinians, in the diaspora, growing up, really not knowing so much about our identity. Of course, we were taught to be really proud of our identity and proud of Palestine, and we would talk about Palestine wherever we went. But the second Intifada really was that kind of reawakening of something and trying to help. And that was the main thing that made me want to pursue human rights work. So that's how I got to where I am.
That's fantastic to hear. That's what we tend to hear from a lot of professionals that work in human rights. They tend to have their own background and their own struggles that they tend to put into their work. So what would you say are the biggest challenges working in international human rights law, particularly from an Australian jurisdiction?
Yeah, my experience is quite limited in the sense that I can only talk about the challenges that I've experienced so far. And I have to be honest at the outset again that it is a limited experience, and I'm certain that others with decades of experience and working in different kind of movements would be able to really, I guess, provide a more detailed answer. But in respect of the kind of work that I'm doing at the moment and was doing in the past, I think one of the main things is that Australia's lack of constitutionally protected human rights in the form of a bill of some kind.
Yeah.
And that really, I think, if you speak to any lawyer working with refugees or working on issues that really impact on people's day-to-day rights or really fundamental human rights, one of the biggest challenges is that it doesn't exist in that sense, and it's difficult for us to challenge really systemic and structural issues that affect people in a really fundamental way.
So just stemming off that, so would you say when you're working in human rights in Australia, besides just challenging the general administrative things that come out of statutes, would you also be doing a lot of advocacy work in that sense in terms of law reform and submissions?
Definitely. I think that it's quite an interesting question because, this is a podcast catered to students, and I was reflecting on my time as a student at law school and whether or not we really or I really thought about law reform and whether I'd be involved in law reform. I mean, we were taught different aspects, whether, in different subjects that would come up, etc., different units, but I never thought about it as something that I'd be engaged in that sense. But it really has turned out to be one of the most interesting things that I'm involved in as a, in terms of the work that we're doing at the centre, at the ACIJ. And it's a really fundamental part, especially where there are real systemic issues or structural issues that really need sustained campaigning and sustained advocacy. So I think law reform, advocacy, and all of that comes with it is really a fun part of lawyering, I think, especially if you're lawyering in the sense that what we're doing at the ACIJ is trying to develop a practice of international crimes investigations and prosecutions where it really doesn't exist at all. And that requires a lot of advocacy. So that's been one of the most, I think, fun things about doing this kind of law and this kind of legal work for the past 3 years. So it's really fun.
Definitely. No, I've read some of the submissions that the ACIJ have done. I'll touch on that in a minute, but it does seem like fantastic work when you kind of do get the best of both worlds. And it's not just black letter law all the time. You've touched on this a little bit, but maybe we'll just go into it in more depth. But what type of work does the ACIJ do?
We do broadly legal research, legal advocacy, as I've said, and actions that kind of trigger authorities to investigate and prosecute international crimes. So by that, I mean working together with community. I mean, where it's the core mission of our work, which is developing, as I said, international crimes, investigations and prosecutions, it's working with communities and affected people, victims and survivors of international crimes to bring together cases or complaints to trigger, as I said, or to request and compel authorities to investigate where we think they should be, where we think there's a good link, where we think there's a good strategy in bringing a case, where there's possibly an Australian link, things like that. So that's the broad general work that we do. And in addition to international crimes, encouraging international crimes investigations and prosecutions, and also develop a universal jurisdiction practice, we do a lot of legal advocacy around international justice issues. So where Australia, particularly where there is an Australian angle, where there is Australian complicity, Australian government complicity or Australian corporate complicity, in situations abroad where there's an international justice angle. So that's the kind of work more broadly that we're doing.
No, that makes a lot of sense. No, thank you for touching on that. So because you do a lot of a mixed type of work, I'll tailor this question my best to what the ACIJ does, but whilst working there, what type of actions, what cases or what type of area do you think inspired you most?
I have been with the ACIJ since the very beginning because I set up the organisation.
Yeah.
And I mean, I can't believe that we're approaching 3 years now. It seems like...
Congratulations.
Thank you. It seems a bit, intense and insane, but we've had a really great time along the way. So some of the work that's really inspired me is really working with different civil society organizations and actors around the world. And I'm thinking in particular in Afghanistan. Of course, that's weighing heavily on my mind right now because we're working with, people, our partner organization, people we've worked with on the Afghanistan project that we've had since we began the organization. So working with those types of people has been really inspiring and invigorating. I mean, they're the ones that are really at the front line of huge crisis. In Afghanistan that we're seeing at the moment, we worked together with a whole host of Palestinian human rights organizations last year, and we're continuing to work with them present. So that to me, I think, is one of the most humbling and inspiring things about doing, about working at the ICJ. It's making those connections, making those collaborations with human rights organizations and human rights defenders abroad, and bringing them here to our site, to our venues of accessing justice, to bring the issues home where Australia is complicit in many major ways, we would say. We've worked on quite a few things so far, but really our main work has revolved around Afghanistan of late, we've done some work on Palestine. In respect of Myanmar, we've really focused on corporate complicity and allegations of corporate complicity, in particular on Adani. And that's another fantastic case where we worked with this wonderful group of really covert activists in Myanmar who are trying to highlight, the economic and financial, control of the Myanmar military, the Tatmadaw. So yeah, I think those are to bring it back to the main point I was trying to make, which is really working with those people is the best thing, I think.
What would you say would differentiate the ACIJ from other human rights organisations in Australia? Because from the looks of it, it's probably one of the first of its kind, because we don't tend to have major conversations about Australia's complicity in international issues, since we don't really see ourselves as a major power in comparison to other countries around the world.
Yeah, look, I really think we are unique in that sense, that we are the first legal centre in Australia that's filling a gap in relation to developing investigations and prosecutions of domestic investigations and prosecutions of international crimes. We're utilising a legal framework that has been around on our legal books for over 20 years, but hasn't been used. We're unique in the sense that we're highlighting issues that other legal centres and human rights organisations aren't really working on. Our context really is about Australia, although we work globally, obviously, with people and organisations all around the world, within our very limited capacity, of course. Mm-hmm. So we're unique in that sense, but in another sense, I think I'm very inspired by different human rights organisations and lawyers here in Australia as well. I think we have a really amazing sector that collaborates and works together really well. So I've seen that, and we're trying to emulate it in the sense that it's working really well as I see, but there are obviously ways that everybody could, and I think collaboration is a huge one in terms of connecting with people overseas, and that's something that I didn't really see so much. But of course, people working on global issues was not a lot in the legal space. Of course, there was, but I think it wasn't done in a way with concepts of solidarity as much, probably. Yeah, I think, of course, you have those big international organizations like Amnesty, like Human Rights Watch, but they're a global international NGO. So I think we bring the Australian context, we bring the kind of legal actions, we work directly with communities and civil society organizations abroad. Yeah. I think they're some of the things that really distinguish us from other legal centres. But having said that, we see ourselves as part of an ecosystem of the human rights sector here in Australia. And we work together with, all sorts of different organisations. We've worked with the human rights space. We've worked with the refugee legal space on many issues. And so, we see ourselves as part of that kind of broad civil society space. Yeah,
no, definitely. Thank you for that. That's very insightful. And the ACIJ seems to be doing really great work that a lot of students I know at UNSW would be interested in getting into, but obviously it was quite limited in an Australian space. So the ACIJ also does work around law reform, as you've mentioned. What submission would be a career highlight in your opinion?
One of the open letters, I guess you could say, that we did last year, just before the Brereton inquiry released its report, we actually got together with a host of human rights organisations here in Australia and humanitarian organisations as well. And then that was the first time really that we worked with Afghan human rights organisations and human rights defenders to bring them in. And that to me was, I guess you could say it was a career highlight. It's kind of weird to think about it in that way, but I think what I'm proud of is that we brought Afghan civil society into the fold, because many of them were aware of the kind of allegations that had surfaced in the media and the reports. And yes, they knew that there was an inquiry going on, but they didn't know about it in so much detail, at least from what we hear. And so that, I think I'm proud of that, because we brought them into the fold, and we brought them as equals because we recognize that they should be leading the conversation. Yeah. They should be leading the advocacy around what's required in terms of, transitional justice, truth, accountability, and, all of those requirements that are needed now in the criminal process or in the not just the criminal justice process rather, but the accountability process more broadly, more widely. Of course, it's not just limited to criminal justice and accountability, and we know that that has also its limitations as a system as well. So bringing them into the fold was really, I think, a really proud movement. And, we consider ourselves as partners. We're partners together in advocating for a victims' rights approach, for an approach that recognises the importance of truth, justice and accountability in the process going forward. So we always work together with them. They tell us what's required. They speak with the victims and the victims' communities. They know their community more than anyone else. So that's one part. And then I think another career highlight for me personally as well, and it's the submission that we did. I mean, we've done a lot of submissions now. I have to say that. I think a lot for small organisations, and all of them have focused on international law obligations relevant to Australia's investigations and prosecutions of international crimes. So, you can go onto our website and see some of them. But perhaps the most recent one that we did was actually not to a parliamentary committee inquiry or anything like that, but it was to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We did that with a coalition of Palestinian human rights NGOs to highlight issues relevant to Palestinian human rights and Australia's obligations in respect of, because this actually, it was an inquiry, but it wasn't termed an inquiry, sorry, it was termed a feasibility study into whether Australia should bring about or enter into a free trade agreement with the State of Israel. And so we recognised, I have to say that a lot of the Palestinian, pro-Palestinian organisations also got on board and provided really great submissions as well. Obviously, ours came from a legal advocacy perspective, and we brought together that really brilliant coalition of, I think it's 11 human rights Palestinian NGOs, all of the really wonderful Palestinian NGOs and human rights organisations and legal centres in the West Bank and Gaza, organisations like Al-Haq, Damir, Palestinian Centre for Human Rights in Gaza, Al-Mizan, all of those wonderful human rights groups have been around for decades and documenting, reporting, monitoring human rights abuses and international humanitarian law violations in the occupied Palestinian territory. So we brought them together, we did a joint submission, we put together a list of recommendations. So I think to date, that's probably one of my most personal career highlights. I'm speaking personally and I'm not speaking on behalf of ACIJ. Yes. And I say that because I think, I allowed myself to, funny saying that on a podcast, but to probably, work on something very close and personal. And it's something that working in the legal space, sometimes you feel that you're not allowed to do as a Palestinian or, as any other minority. And certainly as a Palestinian, because of the deep animosity that people have to Palestinian human rights, that allowed me to come out a little bit more and be very proud of that, but also do it from a very professional and serious. We took it very seriously, and we did it based on what are the recommendations that we would usually make on any other issue that we work on, whether it's on Afghanistan, whether it's on Myanmar, whether it's on rights in respect of obligations Australia has in relation to foreign terrorist fighters that it wants to strip citizenship off. That's the subject of other submissions that we work on. Yes. There's a lot of work, hopefully, that will come as a result of that submission. So to answer your question, that is my other one proud personal career highlight.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that's quite interesting because just in the past, talking to lawyers in general, or looking at things more in the diversity sphere, what we do see is a huge gap in human rights law and international justice is people who are being impacted by these human rights violations are rarely at the forefront of these fights. And that's generally quite saddening to see because it creates this huge gap where who are we really advocating for if we're not advocating for those who are experiencing those directly, and they should be given the voices and the platforms themselves. So that's really great work by the ACIJ. And, thank you for doing that. And it's just really fantastic work all in all. So Outside of Australia, you have also done quite a bit of work. Can you describe those career experiences to students?
Yeah, look, in some respects, I wish I did more than what, the limited experience of abroad. I always intended to, but it never happened. So I guess my advice to anyone else is while you're still young, go abroad and work abroad if you want to. You gain a lot of experiences, you meet really fascinating people. So the two, when I was at university, actually, when I was at law school, I went abroad to do a 3-month stint at Adala, which is the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Haifa. And that was really, really fascinating. They're a great organization. And obviously they work in respect of, they do work with, I'll start again. They work in respect of advancing advancing rights for Palestinian citizens who are citizens of Israel. Although they also work collaboratively and a lot to do with Palestinians inside the West Bank. So just for people who may not be aware, there are in what is the land between the Mediterranean River and the, I'll start again. In the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, obviously the State of Israel controls the entire territory. So that includes the State of Israel itself, the territory of the State of Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territory. So Israeli-occupied West Bank and Israeli-occupied Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem. And so there are Palestinians inside, living inside the State of Israel, what Palestinians call 48 lands. They are Palestinians. There are Palestinians, rather, who also happen to have Israeli citizenship. So they carry citizenship passport, and obviously, from their perspective, they carry second or third class citizenship because there are so many unequal, laws and structures between them and the Jewish Israeli population. So the organization, the legal center that I was working with, Adala, really worked on advancing the rights of Palestinians inside Israel. They did that through legal advocacy, a lot of litigation, and also international legal advocacy as well. So that was one stint that I did. And I was, a baby then, as I still probably am now. In terms of my legal career, I hadn't finished law school at the time, and I did that as part of a social justice internship unit. So if you can do that abroad, I would recommend it. I organized that all on my own, so it wasn't as if the university itself had, allocated or had that center as part of the program. So if there is that kind of flexibility for your university to agree or accept to that, then do it.
Yeah.
The second was in Berlin recently, rather 4 years ago, 2018, the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights. I had been following their work for some time, and a few other organizations and human rights legal groups and legal centers that, I hope to somehow model the ACIJ on. I had been following them for some time and seeing the work that they were doing. And I met someone from that organization at another conference, and they suggested that there was a legal traineeship that they have, and to think about doing it. So, I had looked it up and thought I would love to do this. I kind of, thought about it and kept it in the kind of background for a while until I decided that it was, at that point, I decided it was a good time to go and do it. So that was a really amazing experience. So I learned so much at the ECCHR in Berlin. It was very cold when I was there. I froze my butt off, but we had a good time, and I really developed, in the very short time that I was there, I developed a real love for Berlin, even in the winter, and mostly also for the people that I met. And for the work that they were doing. And they were quite encouraging of me, bringing that kind of work to, not bringing as if I was bringing that kind of Australia, but in doing something in Australia. And, I obviously still question whether I have the capability to do this kind of work. Obviously, you're always self-doubting, but that was really amazing to come back from that experience and start to think about how we could translate that that type of work in Australia. And it's different, obviously, because the practice is so different, and you're trying to develop something from scratch, and you have to obviously contextualize your work to the environment that you're in. But also you're always looking abroad to seeing what can work, what are these amazing lawyers and communities and survivors doing abroad that we can try and emulate here in Australia and learn from. So yeah, that's my international experience.
Definitely, thank you for that. And just on the topic of internships for students listening, we do have the ability at UNSW to do self-organised internships. So I think you can do that once you've completed a certain amount of units. I don't know that off the top of my head, but for students that are looking to do self-organised internships, we do have the ability to do that here. And right. As Rawan said, it's probably something that we would all highly recommend here from the Law Society. So I just wanted to touch on something else just stemming from that question, which is, would you say that your experiences working both in Berlin and working in Israel, for both of those, you've touched on how it's helped you in an Australian context in developing the ACIJ. And would you say working in those different jurisdictions also just helped you develop a broader understanding or a better understanding on how to apply Australian law in this context? Because for example, if you're talking about an Arab minority in Israel and you're doing constitutional challenges and litigation challenges, some would say that that's quite similar to the challenges that we are doing here with the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander minority. So would you say that has helped you develop better understandings of law in an Australian context?
I mean, I think, and I have to be honest about my the limitations of those particular experiences. At Adala, I was an intern. I was a student intern, and in terms of what I learned was about international legal advocacy. So using the UN system and international human rights advocacy and those kinds of things. But of course, I think your point is right in the sense that it's I suppose something that Adala is contending with at the moment. And to be honest with you, I have not followed their work as closely as I'd like to in the last 10 years. But I suspect that they're rethinking strategies around strategic litigation, particularly in respect of laws and structures that are built to facilitate total inequality against Palestinian Arab minority there. So I think in that respect, you can see a lot of similarities between Indigenous communities here in Australia and the Palestinian Arab minority inside Palestine 48 or Israel, the state of Israel. And so I think where it's probably the comparison might be even more pronounced is in respect of the Bedouin communities inside Israel. So communities who have been denied access to really basic and fundamental services like electricity or water or sanitation. So communities that are seen as unrecognized by the state of Israel. And that's, I think, a really interesting comparison to make, and probably has been made, I believe. So I think in those respects, there's a lot that can be learned from both communities about using the law strategically for your aims to advance and protect rights. So I think that's an interesting point that should probably, if it hasn't already been explored, should probably be explored more and look at linkages and kinds of, collaborations and solidarities around Indigenous communities working together about upending, colonized structures that are embedded in legal systems as well. So that's an interesting point, I think, that probably requires people who are expert in those areas to talk more
Definitely.
about that I can't talk more on.
I just wanted to touch on one quick question, but you were talking earlier about kind of an imposter syndrome, and that's something that a lot of law students, particularly law students of colour, tend to experience. When we look at the legal industry in general, whether we're looking at human rights law or we're looking at corporate law, or really any area of law, it is dominated by Anglo-Saxon Australians, mainly men, but also even when we're looking at female leadership, they still tend to be dominated by Anglo-Saxon women as opposed to women of colour. So what would you say is your best way with kind of trying to figure out navigating through imposter syndrome, or your best way of I'm trying to find the best way to word this question, but I'm just generally being a woman of colour in the legal industry and dealing with imposter syndrome. What would be your tips to students struggling with that?
I think it's something that you will always struggle with individually. But what has probably helped is talking about it with your peers and people who share the same interests, share the same cultures, share the same politics, I think obviously is really important.
Yeah.
So I think, and I say that from a personal perspective, but I wish I had more time to prepare an answer that would help students. But from my individual experience, I think building relationships on mutual respect helps.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where people respect who you are and what you have to offer, and they aren't just using you to fill any diversity quota or whatever.
Yeah.
Never letting yourself kind of be somebody's diversity quota.
Yeah.
And I think doing it, whatever you do, doing it in a meaningful way that acknowledges, obviously, I think it's as somebody who has acknowledged that my background has really shaped who I am and why I fight for global justice, accountability, human rights. I think that's something that you should acknowledge. It's not something you can get rid of easily.
Yeah.
It's, I think, actually a value and an asset that many people don't have. People who work in this space, sometimes they don't have that benefit of really knowing a culture really well, or knowing having to deal with those struggles and lack of privileges and access to certain spaces and things like that. Yeah. So I think just building those relationships of trust and really collaborating with people where I think that they begin to see you as bringing all those amazing attributes that define who you are, but also and some more. You're not just somebody who we are, as I said, is being used to fill a diversity quota, but you actually have something meaningful and valuable to add to whatever is the context.
Definitely.
I hope that helps. But
no, it's very helpful, and it
might come back to that.
It's okay. It's actually very helpful, and it's a common theme that we've been hearing this year from a variety of lawyers, because we had we ensured this year on our events that we had a high diversity of lawyers who were joining us, and it was a common question that was asked to lawyers, and that was a common theme in the sense of working for organizations where they accept you for who you are and they accept your beliefs, and you can use that as an asset rather than hiding it. And I think that's a really important tip for students when they do start looking for jobs, is making sure that you're going and working for an organization whose values align with you, and that will definitely allow you to be more comfortable in your place of employment.
And I am, like, when I look, obviously when I look at the generation like yours, Amal, that are coming through, I'm inspired. There are so many young people of colour coming through in the legal sector that are representing, that are leading, they're forming coalitions. I think in respect of now when I'm seeing the the public opinion being pushed in relation to action on Afghanistan has been from the Afghan Australia diaspora. And many of those, I think, are lawyers and law students and people with legal backgrounds that have been at the forefront of, that push from the Afghan Australian community, which has, really amazed me at what they've managed to achieve so far in terms of public pressure that has impacted on government decision making so far. Obviously, there's a long way to go, but that has been really inspiring, seeing that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, and thank you for that insight. And it is something I agree with. I see a lot of our younger generations and our students at the moment in the law school, and a lot of people are very confident in sharing their opinions and sharing their views, regardless of the backlash that they may achieve for it, that they may receive for it. And that's really inspiring for a lot of young law students who are currently entering law schools or entering the legal sector. So I really agree with you on that point. So all in all, from what you've described, you seem to have a very busy life as a lawyer. What do you like to do in your free time?
Free time sounds so nice. Oh, it's so hard to also talk about it while we're in the middle of lockdown, which has been draining on everybody. So I send my deep solidarity from lockdown to everyone across Sydney and around Australia who is also going through lockdown. Free time. So I like to cook. I like to travel a lot, to be honest. So my partner and I, my husband, we like to travel. So not being able to travel has been really, really difficult. I've also dabbled a bit in amateur photography, in particular nature. So when we were allowed to travel, we'd go, and there was one thing that we took part in, which was bird photography in Costa Rica, which was amazing. And I'd like to do that again. We had plans to go see the monarch butterflies in Mexico, but I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon.
Hopefully sooner than later.
So, and when we did travel, we started to get into scuba diving, which was great. It was so much fun. Something that my mum is, constantly worried about and just looks the other way if I tell her we're going on a scuba diving trip. Otherwise, just hanging out with my friends, reading up constantly on what's happening in the world. I actually like to do that. It's not really I need to. I don't need to know. I just really like to know about what's going on and reading about current affairs.
No, definitely, I resonate with that as well.
I'm not a very interesting, boring outsider person.
No, I agree with that.
It's very interesting person outside of my work, which is
it's very interesting, and just like reading on and what's happening around the world, and just even with the power of social media, you can get really fast updates and really accurate information, more so than what you would get in the mainstream media. And I personally like to do that as well. And I find that quite fascinating because you learn about different experiences in different cultures, besides what's going on here in Australia, what's going on abroad for people who are immigrants, what's going abroad in their home countries. So it's quite fascinating, and I agree with that. I think it's something that a lot of law students would agree with as well, because it's an intrinsic passion in the legal industry. Absolutely. I would say. So a lot of students in the law school are quite interested in developing a career in immigration law, particularly people that actually enjoyed administrative law. So small minority there. But what would you recommend they do during and post uni, and including probably subject choices?
I think volunteering at a refugee law centre. That's obviously a good start, because really you're again on the front lines with people who are affected directly by the law and are trying to seek Australia's protection. So that's probably the one thing I would recommend as a top priority, particularly for those who want to get into that field. And I mean, also if you have the privilege and the opportunity to volunteer abroad as well, with refugee and asylum seeker communities in Europe, in the Middle East, in Latin America, in Africa, wherever really. I mean, unfortunately, with the trajectory of, where we are in this militarized in border industrial complex that, we talk about, is that, people are constantly needing to seek safety and protection, but are, caught up with borders that are popping up everywhere and anywhere. So I think if you do want to work in immigration law, you also think about these broader issues that are happening. And of course, immigration law is not just about refugee law. Refugee law is a really tiny part of immigration law. And as somebody who practiced only in refugee law, immigration space is a huge kind of other, immigration legal space is a huge other space. So I would, my remarks are really just about my limited experience in the refugee law space. But if you can volunteer here or abroad, if possible, if you have, as I said, the privilege and the opportunity to, then that's something that's available.
So you mentioned that you had some book recommendations that you wanted to give to students. So maybe if you could give us little book reviews, I guess.
Yes, so I strongly recommend this book by Michael Ratner, Moving the Bar, My Life as a Radical Lawyer. It's a really great, excellent read. In fact, I want to read it again. And this is the type of lawyering that I really look up to. And it's an introduction really to radical and movement lawyering. So I would definitely recommend for all of the law students listening to grab this. It should be available as an ebook and I think an audio book as well. So you can order it if you like, but also get the ebook straight away so you can get stuck into it.
Yeah.
On that point of movement lawyering, I recommend that everyone registers. There are student rates for the Reb Law conferences.
And you are speaking at the Reb Law conference, from my understanding.
I am, yes. Very nervous.
Yes. So thank you so much, Rawan, for your time today. It's been really amazing speaking to you. And I'm certain that students will be gaining a lot of insight from this episode and from this podcast. So thank you, everyone, for listening to InCites by UNSW Law Society today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast so that you don't miss out on any future episodes.